Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today we are going to learn about circle of Willis. Circle of Willis is the system of anastomosis between anterior and posterior blood supplies to our brain. In this figure, the purple one represents the anterior system and the blue one represents the posterior system. Anterior system is also known as carotid system, as the arteries are derived from the carotid artery, and the posterior system is also known as vertebrobasilar system. This circle of Willis is present in the subarachnoid space under the base of brain in front of the midbrain. First of all, we will learn about posterior system. From the subclavian vessels, the vertebral artery will derive. This vertebral artery will meet each other and forms the basilar artery. And this basilar artery will terminate to right and left posterior cerebral artery just above the third cranial nerve exit point in the brainstem. This posterior cerebral artery will supply to the posterior cerebral hemisphere, that is to the occipital lobe and the midbrain. And this vertebrobasilar system will give branch to our cerebellum by giving three branches, that is posterior inferior cerebellar artery, anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the superior cerebellar artery. First one is the pica, that is posterior inferior cerebellar arteries, which arises from this vertebral artery. It will supply to the posterior inferior part of cerebellum and to the lateral medulla. Next is ica, that is anteroinferior cerebellar artery, which originates either from the vertebral or from the basilar artery. It will supply to the anterior inferior part of cerebellum and to the lateral part of the bones. Next is superior cerebellar artery, which arises from basilar artery. It will supply to the upper part of cerebellum and some part of midbrain. Now there is another branch, that is the anterior spinal artery. It arises from the vertebral artery at the level of medulla. They will unite and it will descend down to the spinal cord. It will supply to the anterior two-thirds of spinal cord. There is one anterior spinal artery and two posterior spinal arteries. Next is internal carotid artery. This internal carotid artery, posteriorly it will give posterior communicating artery and anterior choroidal artery, and finally it will terminate into two branches, that is anterior cerebral artery, which will supply to the medial surface part of frontal and parietal lobe, and the middle cerebral artery. This middle cerebral artery gives deep branches to the structures like basal ganglia, striatum, lentiform nucleus, and internal capsule. So this all together we can call it lenticulostriatal arteries or the central arteries. And the artery that will connect the anterior and posterior circulation is the posterior communicating artery. Now we can look in this figure. These two are the vertebral arteries, which comes from the subclavian arteries. It will give branches to pica, ica, and to the superior cerebellar arteries. They will meet and form these basilar arteries. And this basilar artery will give some branches to our bones, which are known as pontine artery. And the basilar artery will terminate by giving posterior cerebral artery. Now the internal carotid artery will give branches, terminates into anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery, and we have already discussed this. Middle cerebral artery will give lenticulostriatal arteries, which is very important. And the anterior communicating artery is the artery which will connect to anterior cerebral artery. But this posterior cerebral artery is the artery which will communicate between this anterior system and the posterior system. What is this advantage of circle of Willis is that if any point have less blood supply, then another part from the another artery, it will give blood and fulfill the demand of our body. And one very important thing we have to know is this anterior communicating artery is the most common site for biliary aneurysms also, that is the small dilatations. So this is all for circle of Willis. I hope you guys understood. We will meet up in our next video.